Then what's to be done? Nancy asked unhappily. Heath Castle will have to be sold for what it will bring, but I'm afraid that won't be much, considering its location and present condition. Floriana wants to keep the property, but she can't. She has barely enough funds to operate Clover Farm. It was some consolation to Nancy that she had brought the sisters together, but she felt as if she had failed in one of the most vital tasks of her life. What if I did solve the mystery of Heath Castle? She sighed. I wasn't able to save the estate or help the Fenimores financially, and they need help so badly. Nancy pondered the problem, but it was not until the next day that an idea came to her. I'll do it at once, she declared. Why didn't I think of it before? Dashing from the house, she got out her roadster and headed it for Mihardy's yacht home. The old man had barely greeted her when she excitedly propounded her scheme. Mihardy shook his head. Your idea's good, me lass, he agreed. The only trouble is there's nary a whelk with dye in it left in that cove near the factory. The one that stained your friend's dress must have been the last one alive. Then you've investigated the inlet since we were there? Nancy asked. Mihardy nodded. How about the beach at Heath Castle? Did you find anything there? I never really looked, replied the old sailor, his face lighting up with hope. Got a few clams that day I was there, and then the trouble started. I never went back. Well, then let's go there right away and look. This time the girl rented a fast motorboat at Campbell's Landing, and in a short while Mihardy was untying his little rowboat from it, and the two eager passengers were skimming across the water to the beach along the Heath estate. Lots of holes in the sand, said Nancy. Do you suppose? The old clam digger set to work with a will. As Nancy watched, he brought up shell after shell from beneath the wet surface. Whelks, he exclaimed excitedly, and dye in 'em, too. Nancy wanted to dance for joy, but she controlled herself until Mihardy had dug up several dozen of the mollusks. You hit it, Miss Nancy, he cried. No doubt of it now, he grinned happily. The place is full of whelks. Nancy felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Now Floriana would have an income. She could keep Heath Castle and fix it up. There's one more thing I must do, the girl thought, as she and Mihardy returned to River Heights. Talk to Cobbs and Biggs. Nancy drove directly to the jail and asked to speak first to Biggs. Since this was his initial offense, she decided he would be more likely to answer her questions truthfully than the former. She told the ex-chauffeur of her recent discovery and asked him if he had found any notations with the bottles of dye. When he demurred about answering, the girl suggested that his sentence might be lightened if he told her everything he knew. All right, I'll tell you, he said grudgingly. I've got nothing to lose. The prisoner revealed that certain notes had been attached to each bottle of dye. Cobb Hooker had thought them of no value, but Biggs had hidden them under a certain flagstone in the cloister walk. Nancy, overjoyed, hastened homeward to tell her father the good news. He looked at her fondly, and how proud he was of her. Nancy, my dear, you saved the day for Floriana and the others, he said, smiling. Then he added, I'll see what I can do for Biggs. There were weeks of uncertainty before the dye project was put into effect. Mr. Drew advanced money to restore the button factory, part of which was used as a laboratory. Mihardy was placed in charge of beach operations, and a young chemist, using the notations left by Walter Heath, gradually worked out several lovely colors from the dye found in the whelks. During the waiting period, Nancy kept on wondering whether Walter Heath might not have made other discoveries. One idea which plagued her was why he had placed the Cinderella footprint in that particular spot. At last a solution came to her. The water in the fountain. It gave George and Bess and me a tremendous lift, she thought excitedly. Maybe it has special value. Again, Nancy Drew had guessed correctly. An analysis of the water proved it to have unusually beneficial qualities, even curative effects in bone disorders. Arrangements were made with a bottling concern to market it. Presently, with money pouring in from two sources, Floriana was given a free hand to establish the gardens at Heath Castle, just as they had been during her romance with its former owner. The crippled woman moved to the estate, taking Mrs. Fenimore and Joan with her. For weeks she planned and supervised. Then came a wonderful day when she was able to fill the gardens with crippled children now laughing and happy. One afternoon upon invitation, Nancy, Bess, George, Mr. Drew, and Lieutenant Masters journeyed to the estate to view the many changes. The great gates stood open. The visitors drove up a winding road between avenues of trimmed hedges and trees. The three girls smiled when they recalled how different everything had seemed to them on their former visits there. "It doesn't make me feel a bit creepy now," laughed Bess. "Those burning eyes that watched me from the evergreen," Nancy chuckled. "I know that they were Cobb hookers." "With him in jail, what's to become of Mrs. Hooker and Jetty?" asked George. "She's gone to work," replied the policewoman. "Jetty has been sent to a special school because only last week he was caught trying to snatch a purse. By the way, he was wearing his father's clothes. Just like the time he ran off with my pocketbook and the pearl from old Mahardy's clam," Nancy said. "It certainly was clever of you, Lieutenant Masters, to have solved that mystery and recovered the pearl for Nancy," said George. The visitors got out of the car near the restored loggia and paused to admire the repairs which had been made to the crumbling walls. The gardens were a mass of bloom. The lawn in front of the castle was velvety smooth and free from weeds. "How did Floriana ever accomplish so much in such a short time?" Nancy marveled. Several pigeons alighted nearby. One of them, startled, flew to the parapet of the far tower of Heath Castle and began to coo. George smiled and whispered to Nancy, "You were right. Those sounds we heard the first day we came here were only pigeons cooing." "I guess I let my imagination run away with me when I was locked in the tower," laughed Nancy. "At that time their cooing sounded human." Bess called the girls' attention to the children who had come out on the lawn to play. A few were in wheelchairs, but they pushed them about with amazing skill. "Floriana is doing remarkable work with these youngsters," said Lieutenant Masters. "She's putting new spirit into them. Joan is developing into a fine little girl, too. She's proving to be a great help to her aunt." "What is she doing?" asked Bess. "Floriana is giving exercises to the children to restore nimbleness to their bodies. Joan does the demonstrating, and incidentally, Joan is the delight of her aunt. She's going to be a wonderful dancer someday." "And take up where Floriana left off," said Bess dreamily. The callers were greeted cordially by the mistress of Heath Castle and her sister, almost restored to perfect health and looking very attractive with a fashionable new coiffure. Tea was served on the terrace. Afterwards, Floriana invited her guests to the Poet's Nook, there to see the children who were lined up at the drinking fountain. "The water is helping to build strong bodies," she said proudly. "Oh, it means so much to me to bring these boys and girls here. I'd never have forgiven myself if I had returned to a lonely life at Clover Farm." Mr. Drew had been waiting for this very moment. Taking a tiny box from his pocket, he slipped it into Floriana's hand. "A little surprise," he explained. The woman slowly raised the lid. Nestled in it, purple velvet, there was a ring set with a huge pearl. "Not the one Walt meant for me?" Floriana asked, dazed. "Yes, but how did you recover it? I thought Hector Keep had found the ring and sold it." "Dad was able to trace it," Nancy spoke up. "Mr. Keep failed to notice the inscription inside." Tears filled Floriana's eyes as she read, "To my Cinderella. I'll wear the ring always in memory of Walt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, Nancy, my dear friend, and Mr. Drew, you've made me very, very happy." Nancy smiled. She was glad the mystery had been brought to a successful close. Now she could devote more time to a new one on which she was working. Already Nancy was calling it The Mystery of the Tolling Bell. Her gaze wandered along the stately cloister of Heath Castle. With the afternoon sun sinking low, the shadows in the passageway had never looked more beautiful. "Don't thank me for helping you, Floriana," Nancy said earnestly, taking her hand. "Thank these crumbling walls. They provided the clue that brought you here." and forever they'll remain a symbol of mystery and romance.